ministers, ambassadors, vice presidents of the African Development Bank, and the other dignitaries in this audience, I welcome you to the session on inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa, a collaborative activity involving the African Development Bank, the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD or outer NEPAD, and the African Union Commission. And we have audience both in this hall and virtually. So it's a relatively large group. The way it is that after these introductory remarks, we are going to have a video which is going to introduce the session. Thereafter, we are going to have a very brief opening ceremony. I'll give a few remarks on behalf of the chairperson of the African Union Commission and the vice president from the African Development Bank involved for delivery, among other activities. We'll give our open remarks on behalf of the president of the African Development Bank Group. And thereafter, we are going to do the moderation, the panel discussion, and I'll moderate that panel discussion, which we have initially a presentation by the Vice President for Knowledge Management at the African Development Bank, Professor Kevin Urama, and then we have the panel discussion. And before we go into the video, let me introduce myself. I'm Albert Mchanga. I'm the Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry and Minerals in the African Union Commission. And I've been working very closely with Professor Urama and the Chief Executive Officer of outer NEPAD on this study. But behind us are very qualified professionals who have been doing the actual work. So now let's have a look at the video. Thank you very much.
For decades, African economies have experienced fluctuations in their GDP growth rates, with some periods raising hopes that Africa was rising. Those periods of optimism have repeatedly been overshadowed by external shocks that have led to a downward trend in GDP growth rates within a short time span. The African Union's Agenda 2063, the African Development Bank's High Five Strategy, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of 2030 all champion the principle of accelerated, inclusive, and sustainable development. And each institution has its own mission towards a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. The AU Commission, the African Development Bank Group, and the African Union Development Agency NEPAD are thus partnering on a multi-sector study to detail key actions required to place each African country on a path of 7 to 10% annual GDP growth maintained over the next 40 years. We need to create sustained growth to build resilient economies capable of mitigating a relenting combination of internal and external shocks while ensuring environmental sustainability. This is the Thematic Knowledge Event, Key Actions to Achieve Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Development in Africa. The reformation starts now.
Thank you very much. I'm sure the message is very clear from that short video clip. And my message is going to be very, very brief. When you look at the African Union Agenda 2063, the first aspiration is on inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa. To prosper Africa anchored on inclusive growth and sustainable development. We've had 10 years of implementation of the African Union Agenda 2063. And we felt that time has come to translate that aspiration into a program activity, and hence the partnership. Those of you who have attended some sessions where the president of the African Development Bank has made some statements during these meetings of the African Development Bank Group. One of the key points he has made is that Africa needs to grow at double digit. He has made that point repeatedly. And we are saying, let us start with 7 to 10% and see if we can attain and sustain those levels. The encouraging thing is that among the fastest growing economies of the world, almost half of them are in Africa. But the key issue again is that those are not enough. To reduce poverty in Africa, we need to increase the number of African countries and their economies growing at those high levels in a very inclusive process and in a manner that protects the physical environment we all live in. Our experts tell us that it's possible for Africa to have high rates of growth because we are starting from a low income base. However, in order to attain and sustain that, we need to increase investments from the current level of 20% of Africa's gross domestic product to 40%. Very ambitious, very high levels, but that has a historical precedent. One of the fastest growing economies in the world is China. At one time, China devoted 47% of a GDP over a period of 10 years to investment. And the miracle is before our eyes. And for Africa to increase that rate of investment, domestic resources are very key. We have to enhance capacities to mobilize domestic resources. And we do so against a very challenging environment. Not too long ago, I was in another panel discussion on tax administration in Africa. And the message emerging from that panel discussion is that annually, Africa loses about $200 billion through tax incentives to investors. And in addition to that, Africa loses $90 billion due to illicit financial flows from the continent. You combine that They've a figure of about 290 billion US dollars. The hemorrhage continues. About 10 days ago, the World Bank came out with a study where they surveyed current export management practices across Africa as Africa continues to export her raw materials. And the message emerging there is that there's 60% underperformance. So we need to strengthen, and this is part of the study, domestic resource mobilization to ensure that we finance this study, among other activities that need to be undertaken. And they're encouraging results. The African Tax Administration Forum has been involved by 27 African countries to see if they can get back some money by eliminating some loopholes in transfer pricing and by having access to exchange of information. And through that effort, they have been able to get back 3.8 billion US dollars to those 27 African countries. So when one looks at the outflows of 290 billion US dollars, if we can come up with a mechanism of ensuring that we have a systematic way of getting back that money or conserving that money, then we'll be able to have a strong domestic financial base to finance the study on inclusive growth and sustainable development, and also enhance capacities in export administration. Furthermore, we enhance capacities to ensure that locally all companies and nationals pay their taxes on time and in full. As I come to the conclusion of my brief opening remarks, I would like to underline the fact that this study was made possible by a very strong sense of collaboration between the chairman of the African Union Commission, His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, and the president of the African Development Group, His Excellency Adesina. And building on that, we have worked very closely to bring this study to where it is. And our target is to finalize it by December this year. And it will undergo stakeholder scrutiny through panel discussions like this. We're going to have a similar one when we meet the finance ministers in July this year, and the ministers responsible for integration and economic planning. And the study is going to be rolled out to the Assembly of the African Union Heads of State and Government when it meets in February next year. And thereafter, we embark on a domestication effort so that it's part of the programming processes at national level. And it's going to be one of the flagship programs in the second year implementation plan of the African Union Agenda 2063. And you saw the video. The effort is to have a prosperous Africa, which is inclusive, which is integrated, which is sustainable developing by 2063. I'll end here, and since I'm also the moderator, I'll now invite my sister, the Vice President from the African Development Bank, to give her opening remarks. I thank each and every one of you for your kind attention. Madam, you have the floor.
Good morning, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I am Marie-Laure Aquino-Lugbade, Vice President at the African Development Bank Group, and I have the pleasure of delivering these opening remarks on behalf of President Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group. I am delighted to welcome you all to this side event on our study on key actions to drive inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa. This research project is a collaborative effort by the African Development Bank Group, the African Union Commission, and the African Union Development Agency, AUDA-NEPAD. I would like to commend His Excellency Moussa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission. When he contacted me to propose this research project, my response was instant and emphatic. Yes, because the need for accelerated growth to improve living standards, achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the African Union Agenda 2023 is clear. For that to happen, Africa would need to consistently maintain a 7% growth rate for the next 4 to 5 decades, eradicate poverty, and reach a high income status. This will be difficult, but not impossible. According to the African Development Bank 2023 Annual African Economic Outlook Report, the average GDP growth for the continent slowed from 4.8% in 2021 to 3.8% in 2022. And this decline was across the board. 31 out of 54 countries in Africa posted weaker growth rates in 2022 relative to the previous year. However, we anticipate growth to rebound to 4% in 2023 and to accelerate further to 4.3% in 2024. Yet, we must recognize that the fluctuation in growth that have defined our past. Some of our countries have experienced remarkable growth rates, it has been said by my brother, Commissioner Muchanga, only to fall back upon challenging times. We must learn from these examples to build a future that ensures sustained growth and prosperity. We acknowledge that our continent has had its share of difficulties, growth, stagnation, decline, and even catastrophic falls. And these statistics remind us of the work that still needs to be done. Today we face an increasingly complex and uncertain world. Health, financial, socio-economic, and environmental shocks threaten our progress toward the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the African Union Agenda 2063, and our own Development Bank High Five priorities. The triple challenges of COVID-19, conflict, and climate change, the famous triple C of President Adesina, have exposed the vulnerability of our health system and the fragility of Africa's growth pillars, especially our high dependency on commodity exports and external finance, including debt, remittances, foreign direct investment, and development assistance. But as we acknowledge the challenges that lie before us, we must recognize the incredible potential and opportunities that Africa possesses. And I would like to just mention our continent youth, vibrant youth, one of the youngest and fastest growing population in the world. And I want to stress that this demographic shift offers us the prospect of a demographic dividend, a huge labor force to support Africa's quest for industrialization and lower production costs. Our young people are our greatest asset. And this is why we must invest in them, we must equip them with the skills and opportunities they need to drive our continent forward. Second, I would like to mention the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which will be a game changer. By 2032, it could increase trade by 52%. It will stimulate intra-African trade by up to $35 billion per year, and it will reduce import from outside the continent by $10 billion. Our agricultural and industrial export could be boosted by up to $45 billion and $21 billion, respectively. And these figures reflect a brighter future for trade and economic cooperation among African countries. Third, we are endowed with abundant natural resources, which, if harnessed responsibly, can generate significant returns, revenues, and foster job creation. We know the statistic, Africa holds 30% of the world's mineral reserve and is richly endowed with land, water, seas, forests, biodiversity, you name it, we have it. And these resources are the foundation upon which we can build a more sustainable and prosperous future. Ladies and gentlemen, these studies serve as a vital roadmap to guide us toward the future where each African nation can achieve an annual GDP growth rate of 7 to 10% over the next 40 years. But growth alone is not enough. We must address issues of good and transparent governance, inequality and poverty. We have a responsibility to facilitate green structural transformation, diversify growth sources, and innovatively champion the need to combat and the need to embrace climate change and support environmental sustainability. We must create an Africa that is both economically thriving, socially equitable, and environmentally sustainable. Today's event marks a significant milestone in our journey as the study consortium presents their emerging findings to this distinguished audience. We eagerly await the final report, which will be shared by heads of states and governments. And I would like at this stage, on behalf of President Adesina, to extend our deepest gratitude to Mr. Albert Muchanga, Professor Albert Muchanga, Commissioner for Trade and Industry of the African Union Commission, and Professor Kevin Urama, Chief Economist and Vice President for Economic Governance and Knowledge Management at the African Development Bank, and their leadership in the implementation of these studies. Please, let's give them a round of applause. As we move forward, your feedback and input are invaluable in refining the study and helping Africa shape its own unique development path, one that finds the right balance between economic, social, and environmental dimensions, while also reflecting our diverse endowments, institutions, and aspirations. So now let us move forward together, united in our mission to build the Africa we want. Let us open a new era of shared prosperity, and let us transform our continent into a beacon of hope, progress, and opportunity for all Africans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, my sister. Could we give her another round of applause? It was a statement well delivered with the very, very key messages. And we move on. At this stage, we are going to have a presentation. And I invite the Vice President and Chief Economist, Professor Kevin Urama, to come and make the presentation. And let me indicate that yesterday I was appointed as a professor by President Adesina. I accept that professorship. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Flicker. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to present to you the emerging outcomes of this study on key actions to drive inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa. Let me point out, as my brother, Commissioner Albert Muchanga, have already said, the study is a product of global experts on inclusive growth and on economic development. There are too many that I can't mention all of them. And the purpose of this presentation is also that if we have other inputs that are required for us to have an inclusive thinking to come up with inclusive solutions to achieve inclusive growth in Africa, it's a call for you to step forward and present that to us so that we can work together. The outline will look at Africa's commitment to inclusive growth, the growth performance of the continent going beyond the short term, basically looking back into history so we can identify areas we have done well and areas we need to improve. Then look at the challenges and opportunities emerging that can allow us to identify the key drivers that will allow this new growth model we're talking about to come about. And then state the objectives of the study, the emerging findings that all the lead authors and contributing authors have come up with, and draw some conclusions. Here is about the commitments, which I won't repeat. The video and the presentations by President Adesina and also Albert Muchanga has raised all this. We have several commitments. The Agenda 2063, an inclusive and prosperous Africa. Goal 8 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, inclusive development is key. The African Development Bank's high fives also is articulated to drive inclusive and green growth in Africa. And from history of development around the world and economic literature, we see that countries that sustain more than 7% GDP growth over a period of 4 decades or more are the only ones that break from the vicious cycles of poverty and then continue to create the structural transformations in their economies to sustain growth over time. So that's how we set that goal to be 7% for where we go. And there, the sustainable growth we talk about is not about going green alone. It is about triangulating the social, the economic, and environmental aspects of growth. So inclusivity for us is not just about including gender and other economic sectors. It's also about including the bio and the social economic ecosystem that is required to sustain growth going forward. What are the challenges that we are seeing? First, yesterday we presented the AEO, and we have that positive optimism about resilience in Africa. Despite all the challenges, countries continue to grow at impressive rates above the global average, just very close to Asia. Now, if you look at the right side, you find volatility. So the volatility in Africa's growth is one major concern because Africa keeps rising and falling. So why is that we can continue the trajectory. This is one of the things we want to identify in this study. But then if you try then to look at decades, so if you try to decompose the growth by decades and look at other regions, here we compare several African countries that have managed to achieve 7 to 10% growth rate over a decade or two, and no African country has been able to sustain that for 3 decades. But we see that other regions, continents and countries like China, Singapore, and others have managed to do that. So we also want to do some case studies of understudying those countries to see what they did that we also need to do. But studying African countries that have managed to grow by a few, that percentage, I've listed some of them on the right side there, that to see what they were doing that made them get that 7% for 1 or 2 decades. And then what happened? Why did they collapse, come down in deceleration in growth? So that issue of where is their failed takeoffs on the continent is central to this particular study. And I've given examples of some of the countries there. Of course, China, we know, grew for about an average of 8.6% from 1971 to 2021. And we know the story of China. If you look at Singapore, South Korea, and others, these are recent growth transformations that we could learn from. But you also look into Africa, you find countries that we can learn from. Equatorial Guinea grew from 3.4% and was rising at like 29.4%. Impressive, though from a low base, but that was sustained over the 1990s, but something happened. Then it crashed. And now that country is estimated to be growing at negative rates for now. So what's going on here? So that's the kind of questions we're asking. But this is not about aggregates in terms of Africa. We also need to look at the countries where the decisions are being made. So on this, you just see the same pattern. Some African countries have managed to continue to have an upward trajectory that is sustained over time. So what are they doing that others need to learn? We have Botswana, Burkina Faso, of course, Cape Verde, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, and others. We didn't list every country here because of cluttering the PowerPoint. But the point, we see some countries that have been going forward. What can we learn from them? We see also countries that have been going downwards. What can we learn from them? So we learn from successes and failures so that we'll be able to come up with the drivers that will allow us to grow faster. And this slide is very telling because when you look at a longer term in terms of how Africa has benefited from the current growth dispensation, the global financial architecture that we've been talking about, the global institutions that were set up in the post-World War era to help economic transformation and structural reforms, you find that Africa is like on the x-axis. So you see that red arrow showing where Africa is compared to the rest of the world. But you have a bunch of 3 countries, that's 3 regions that stand out. What can we learn from them? Why is Africa at that level, given all the potentials that we have been talking about? So Africa has continued to have a declining share of global trade. So how are we relating with the current global trade architecture? How should our trade policies change in order to ensure that we can gain better? If you look at the 1950s, that black spots on the bar charts there is Africa. It has been going down and now currently around 3% of the global trade. Why is this? When other regions are at like 15% and more. So we need to think, what are they doing that we're not doing? Human Capital Index will find the same trajectory on the continent. Again, what are other regions doing that we need to do better? Because of time, I'm going to be rushing through these PowerPoints. And then factor productivity in Africa is also like on the x-axis, lowest amongst other regions. And we picked agriculture, which is employing over 60% of Africa's population. If you look at others, manufacturing value added in every sector, we have the same kind of story. So these are challenges that has led to Africa almost remaining stagnant with regard to structural transformation of our continent. If you look at just 3 decades behind, the structures of the economies has not changed very significantly. When you disaggregate these to regions, you find that Eastern Africa has really done much better than the others. What are they doing that others are not doing? And then we need to learn from all those. So one message I want us to take home from here is that the short-term shocks we have, like COVID-19, the triple Cs we have talked about, climate change, conflicts, and other global headwinds are not the real sources of Africa's poor growth. They only exacerbate them. There are structural issues that we need to address within African countries in order to be able to get forward. And what we've also seen is that times of crisis also are times of innovation for many countries that have been able to move forward. And you just need to look at the containerization of trade after the post-World War, after the Second World War by the United States, to see how countries use opportunities of crisis in order to grow. And the same thing happened in Europe. So we need to learn from that. So why is Africa's story different? One thing jumping out of the study is institutional capacity. And if you look at the capacity for public administration, the quality of budgetary and financial management, which is one of the things that Professor Albert Muchanga has already raised for us this morning, transparency, accountability, and corruption, economic management, efficiency in revenue mobilization, we've got a lot of work to do. So these areas we need to think very carefully about, because we know from institutional economics that institutions shape transaction costs in countries. So when we talk about the cost of capital being higher in Africa than elsewhere, institutional structures is one of the reasons. Creation of markets, specialization and division of labor, economic performance, but also how innovation happens, the behavior of organizations, all these things are driven by institutions. So we need to start focusing on how to build our institutions to be able to drive sustained growth on the continent, not growth that is epileptic and depending on external factors only, external flows mainly. Now here, the second thing that's coming out is research and innovation that drives change everywhere. Africa is on like x-axis again, around 0.5% on average investment in R&D by our African countries. But if you look at the pack of all the other countries and regions, they're investing much more. So these are already areas we need to come up with practical actions that will allow us to be able to move forward and be in the league of other nations and other regions. Because of lack of investment in R&D, patents are very low on the continent. And we know that markets pay for royalties for intellectual property. So we spend a lot of time thinking about transfer of intellectual property rights, but we also need to think about creation of intellectual property rights within our own shores, and that is possible. The third one is what we addressed in the AEO this year, what I call the commodities conundrum. With all the potentials listed there, Africa is still among the poorest with regard to other regions. But something already starts jumping out in our analysis. Look at this figure on the right. It comes from the AEO. We praised Eastern Africa for how they have managed to even escape recession during the COVID-19 pandemic. Central Africa is doing well. Look on the other side is the proportion of natural capital in these regions. Eastern Africa is not as high as North Africa or West Africa, or even South Africa, but they are doing well. Diversification of their economies is the source of that growth. So what we are seeing from here then is that access to having natural capital is not actually a sine qua non for good growth. You need to transform that to economic wealth. Now, one of the reasons why this is happening is that the real price of most commodities that Africa trades in the global market has been going down over time. And then also you see another reason, volatility. The prices has been volatile, and because of that, the GDP growth of countries that depend more on that are volatile as well. So we need to think about beneficiation and how we leverage natural capital to be able to move forward. These other slides, I will not speak to them, but it's just to show some of those commodities we all depend on for our GDP growth. Oil, volatility is the name of the game, but the price of the products that we need to consume, energy, food, metals, and agricultural inputs, keeps going up. So when you have a volatile income source and the price of your commodities that you need to be able to work with is going up, poverty is expected to continue to deepen. And this slide we also saw yesterday in the launch of the AEO and 2 days ago. And then the fact here that we want to make is moving up the value chain is moving up your revenue source. And I won't dwell so much on that. Take an example of countries that export copper in Africa. If you look at Zambia and South Africa, their global share of copper exports and the total value of that copper, raw copper export, very low compared to the higher value chains. So it's not only in electric vehicles, it's in all sectors. Now, infrastructure gap, we have all talked about it. We know that infrastructure improves the cost of doing business, it improves productivity and all those things, but we still have up to over $100 billion in infrastructure gap in Africa. I'm going to rush through because of time. We will get the PowerPoints and you can look at it and more. Now, we focus a lot on the exogenous factors. Climate change, yes, it is happening, but it's a position of opportunity as well. Global insecurity, geopolitics of development, and spillover effects of global market trends. All these are exogenous shocks that we may not be able to stop ourselves as Africans, but we can be able to deal with all the other major drivers that we've already identified. So based on this, here are the objectives of the study. Identify the key enablers and barriers, formulate implementable remedies, explore synergies and complementarities existing within our existing policies, not creating new ones, and then propose recommendations and key actions that needs to be done. So we've structured the report that will come out in December in these 11 chapters, which I will just let you read through. Human capital development, agriculture and agro-industries, natural capital, state capacity, institutions and governance, external drivers, integrated productive infrastructure development, business capital, industrial capital, financing for growth, and dynamic monitoring and evaluation tools that we need, then conclusions and recommendations. What are the findings already emerging from the study? Africa has done well in terms of human capital development with the index of around 0.4, which is comparing nearly what you have on average for the global, which is 0.57. So if you look at the report, you will find details on what, when the report comes out, you'll find details on the analysis around the human capital formation and what the recommendations we are making. On integrated productive infrastructure, which is the third chapter, we also see that infrastructure remains low in Africa. It's a major constraint, actually, to trade and regional integration on this continent. 0.2 in terms of the infrastructure index, 0.2 out of 1. And then the rest of the things on the slide you can see. But AFCFTA that we all have now, thanks to the policies and the commitment of our countries, but we need work to be able to make that function. You will find the details on that. On agriculture, I won't dwell so much on it. We know it's the mainstay of jobs for many people in Africa, but limited productivity, which I've talked about because of lack of technology and so on. And we need to talk about also climate impacts and so on in that. On business capital, that's what we focus the AEO on. So I'm not going to discuss so much on business capital. We spend quite a lot on how to leverage that to go forward. Natural capital, was also one of the chapters we have discussed in the AEO, so I will also not dwell on that so much, but this is a key area that we really need to work on in order to be able to move forward. Industrialization and manufacturing, we'll have one of our leading experts here. I think he should be in the room, Professor Banjo Yeyinka, leading this chapter. And then you see, if you read that chapter, you can see opportunities lost in Africa that we really need to be able to move forward with, and different ways that that can be addressed going forward. Financing for growth, we have already talked about the taxation and domestic revenue mobilization and other things compared to what other parts of the world, and also the leakages we're having. So that's an area that we need to address going forward. And then the external drivers, we know the external drivers we have also been discussing, and I'm not going to go too much into details on that. But let me just dwell on the third point there, that tightening of global financial conditions and capital outflows are major challenges on the continent. Even when we talk about debt, you heard yesterday about exchange rate volatility, currency devaluation and other things being major drivers of the cost of debt servicing on the continent. Now pushing that beyond 10% of government revenue and so on. Then we have monitoring and evaluation tools. We need to come up with very clear monitoring tools that will allow the African Union and member states to be able to monitor progress each country. So we need growth models for each country and have clear targets and set clear guidelines. So what should we then do on the continent? There are multiple things already coming out from the study. Enhancing state capacity comes on top. Enhancing state capacity and macroeconomic stability is really on top of what needs to be done. But we also need to continue to enhance human capital. We also need regional integration and trade. There are progress being made, but more needs to be done. Private sector engagement, we dwelt on it at these annual meetings. Natural resource dependence, how to leverage that natural capital for growth is another thing there. Digitization of economies that can help in all these things we have talked about, but harnessing the youth and women, the demographic dividend of this continent is also something that needs to be done. And then there are specific case studies of African countries that have done well and that we can learn from, but also countries in Asia and Europe that we also can learn from, and strategic public finance management. And the bank is already responding to some of these by creating like the Public Financial Management Academy and a lot of the innovations that the president of the bank already spoke about in the opening remarks. In conclusion, we continue to face significant challenges, but it is possible for Africa to grow at 7 to 10% consistently over the next decade. Achieving these goals are possible from what we are seeing so far. And then different kinds of things that needs to be done in terms of policies are listed here. I'm not going to go through them because of time. Let me just conclude with these words. In the middle of every difficulty lies opportunities for innovation. These are Albert Einstein's words. We cannot use an old map to explore the new world. So we need to think about these new growth models for each country, new growth models for Africa, because the existing growth models are not really giving us what we need on a sustained basis. But we also need to keep in mind that there needs to be some social redistribution of incomes and revenues and other things. These are not my words. These are words of wise ones that have studied society and economies around the world. And with that, I will call on you, all ministers here that are African ministers, and then also the non-regional member countries of the bank group. We need your experiences. We need your expertise. We need you to join hands with us so that we can stand together to create a new model of growth for Africa, so that we can achieve inclusive and sustainable development on the continent, without which the SDGs will not be achieved. Thank you.
Let's give him another round of applause. Thank you very much, Professor Urama. At this stage, we go into the stage of the panel discussion. And I'm going to invite to come in front here our distinguished panelists. The first one is Madame Ulmana Sang, the Minister of Economy, Planning and Cooperation, and the Governor for Sectoral Bank for Senegal in the African Development Bank. And the second one is Mrs. Cheryl Aban, Director General, Economic Development and International Financial Institutions of Canada. Take a seat. And the third one, but not the least, is Mr. Toshiyuki Nakamura, the Senior Vice President in charge of Africa in JICA. Let's go straight to the discussion, and I'll begin with you and follow in that order. And the same question for each one of them. You are able to watch the presentation and listen to the presentation itself by Professor Urama. I'd like you to give us your general reaction. And specifically, what do you think are the key issues to achieve inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa in the next 40 years?
Okay. Is this on? You can,
yes,
okay,
it's on.
Perfect. Thank you. And let me just say, it was a pleasure to host you, Commissioner, in Canada last week. We had the Commissioner to talk about our Canada trade policy dialogue with the AUC, so that was really wonderful, thank you, and it was a really great presentation about that study. So I'd like to go into a little bit of detail just about Canada's approach, because I think there's a real value in sharing information about our different approaches to this, and using information like we saw in that presentation. I can say that Canada, its policy thinking in this area has been evolving, and we've been using information to tailor our approaches. Of course, the way that we go about this is informed by our feminist international assistance policy, and within that we have different action areas, and one of them is called Growth That Works for Everyone. And our programming in this area falls under that priority. I'm just going to highlight a few of the areas that we think are very important that we focus on, and I'll elaborate a little bit on the how we do that. One is by supporting micro and small SMEs, and we do that by especially focusing on women SMEs and youth-run SMEs. We help them by providing access to capital, by helping them with business development, networking, and mentorship. But as well, we recognize that it's very important to address this issue in fragile and conflict-affected situations, especially because under the feminist international assistance policy, our objective is to reach the poorest and the most vulnerable, and we know that they're disproportionately impacted by fragility and conflict. And so the focus there really, and this was mentioned, I saw in the presentation about institutional structures and the need to invest in those, and I think it's very critical. I'll move next to trade. Our ministry is a combination of our trade, foreign affairs, and development. We merged about almost a decade ago, and the reason is because we wanted to foster cross-fertilizations. We've been evolving our thinking about how to do trade, and we're doing it more and more in a way that's inclusive and that's respectful of the fact that all people within society should benefit from trade agreements and from trade generally. And so the way that we approach trade is that we want it to be informed. We want it to be as a result of consultation. We want to include transparent provisions in there. For example, some of our trade agreements have a gender chapter specifically so that we make sure that the benefits of trade are reaching absolutely everyone. And then finally, we do some advocacy around that to encourage others in the international community to approach trade from the same perspective. We are addressing agri-food systems because, like was mentioned in the presentation, this is an absolutely critical area for the continent. We focus on small shareholder farmers, especially women as well. I'll end just on two quick other things. Addressing the labor gap is a critical aspect. A couple of years ago, our Prime Minister announced a $100 million commitment towards addressing paid and unpaid care. This is something I think that is often overlooked. But the burden, the care burden on many women in our societies prevents them from contributing to our economies. And then our economies suffer for that. And so Canada is really pushing on that. And I'll just end by talking about quality infrastructure. Canada is working with its partners, especially in the G7 lately, to make sure that we are a part of a solution where infrastructure is provided, but it's done in a thoughtful way, so that it is with a view to benefiting everyone and mitigating negative impacts on certain populations. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Aban. And I'll move next to Minister Sarr. The same question, you listened and heard. What is your general reaction? And what do you think are the key issues to achieve inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa? You have the floor.
Thank you so much. I can say that Senegal should be the poster child of that presentation. Senegal, for the past 7 to 8 years, had an average growth rate of 6%. The lowest growth rate we had was during COVID, 1.8% in 2020. And already in 2021, we were at 6.1%. 4.8 in 2022 because of the war in Ukraine and all its consequences on our economy. And now, in 2023, Senegal is part of the top 10 countries, 10% growth rate expected. Some more conservative institutions are saying 8, but it's very clear that we are on an emerging path. Senegal has a very ambitious national development plan, a national development plan that is anchored on 3 pillars. One is changing the structure of our economy. We call it structural transformation. Second is on investing on human capital. Some people might know Senegal spends 25% of its national budget on education and vocational training. Third is good governance, peace and security. And in order to achieve that, you need to address 5 main areas, and it was very well reflected in the presentation. You need to address issues of policy. So how do you change your legal framework? How do you make your country attractive? How do you enhance the rule of law and access to justice? The second is skills. Everybody talked about it. How do we make our citizens, our people, more productive? And that you do that by investing in human capital. Third is financing. And financing, as a sitting minister, is the most difficult pillar of all, and I will come back to it. Access to market, you mentioned it, within your union, in a broader regional body and at the continental level. And lastly is on basic infrastructure, which is water, energy, roads, and technology. And overall, those 5 pillars have a common thread, which is data. You cannot share knowledge, you cannot draft policy, you cannot make an informed decision if you are not able to collect data on a regular basis. The Sustainable Development Goals, for those who know, the agenda that was agreed upon in 2015 by the whole world to reach 17 critical goals by 2030 are anchored on indicators. 169 indicators that all countries have to report on, and half of the continent cannot report on it. Senegal reports on 85% of the Sustainable Development Goals. I come back to the financing part, because that's the most difficult. You know, when I used to work in a large institution, and you always wonder why governments are not doing this, are not doing that. When I was appointed, I realized that the biggest constraint of any government on this continent is the constraint of resources, not the constraint of ideas. We have to invest in education, it's a lot of money. We have to invest in infrastructure, it's a lot of money. Today, the conversation is very much polarized. The conversation is all about climate. Are they asking African countries to choose between climate and development? Particularly when on the issue of climate, we have no historical responsibility for the climate change. The whole continent contributes to 3% of global emissions. So the study is critical, lessons learned from countries that are doing well. How do we reform the global world? Because we've been talking a lot about the global financial infrastructure, because we know what needs to be done. What is lacking is the resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Sir. We continue. Now we move on to Mr. Nakamura. Do I need to repeat the question? I'm sure you are clear. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, first of all, for this wonderful opportunity this morning. And then I would say, according to the presentation and the speech previously, I found that this is very challenging and then very holistic approach to the continent up to 40 decades. That is a very wonderful survey, I think. And then I would say one thing the mention about the study is stability of the continent. Well, if we lose the stability of the continent, it's very difficult for the sustainable development of the society and the economy and so forth. In other words, I would like to recommend to think about the concept of no one left behind of the continent. That is going to be a key of the sustainability of the development of the continent. And then we are forcing very uncertainty era, including like multiple compounded risks, including pandemic, war in Ukraine, and then so forth. And then we are unfortunately expecting next round of kind of the crisis. Therefore, we have to prepare for another round of the crisis. That is a very important issue for them. In order to do so, everyone mentioned the human capital investment is very important, I think, especially on the continent. The younger generation is increasing. If the younger generation is trained and then also educated or giving them the chance and the opportunity, it's going to be, how can I say, hope of the continent eventually. Therefore, I would like to increase the resilience of the continent. We have to think about investment in human capital as well as the infrastructure development. And then I would say one more thing I want to say is 40 years is a very long period of time. Mm-hmm. So the role of the Africa gonna be changed dramatically. Maybe in 4 decades time, Africa going to be a leader of the globe. So we think about the new role of the Africa to the globe. That is another point of view to add on this wonderful survey, I would say. Thank you.
Can I add something on what he just said?
Yes,
that was,
go ahead.
I fully agree with him that the biggest threat to peace is poverty. So you have to address the issue of economic empowerment. in order to achieve peace, you need to invest in prevention. And prevention is giving your people livelihood, access to water, to energy, to hope and perspective. And that governments are able to do that when they invest in social services and basic protection. But I totally agree with him that peace is extremely important, but it has to be achieved through alleviating poverty.
Thank you very much. When we adopted the African Union Agenda 2063, it was for a period of 50 years, from 2013 to 2063. By that time, they will be celebrating 100 years of Africa's independence. But to make it measurable, it has been divided into 10-year implementation plan. So this activity we're undertaking is going to be one of the flagship programs of the African Union Agenda 2063 in its second-year implementation plan. I'm quite elderly. I don't know if I'll be alive, but the youth will be alive. They'll be able to know that we are making progress or not. Then the focus is over a period of 20 years, so that when Africa has attained 100 years of decolonization, we'll say, have we made the continent prosperous? Is it inclusive? Is it developing while conserving and preserving the environment? But all of you have made a lot of issues which really more or less align to the presented issue. Issues of human capital development, which is skill development. Issues of inclusivity through small and medium enterprises. Issues of interdependence through regional and international trade. They came up from your reactions. And critically, the issues of governance, the institutions matter. All those are fully aligned to the presentation made earlier. So we move to the next stage again. I'll ask you one question which all of you will be expected to answer. And the question is, what are the key contributing sectors and enablers to inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa generally and across country classifications based on specific characteristics like low income, middle income, transition countries, resource-intensive, net or exporting countries, and so forth? Is the presentation focusing on these issues properly? So we'll start at the end with Mr. Nakamura and come this way.
Okay. Thank you for your question. It's very difficult to answer question, but I just want to mention the one thing. I mean, I would say, as I told you, we have to concentrate on the resilience to build up the resilient society within the Africa at this moment. And then in order to do so, of course, we have to concentrate and we have to think about the inviting the private sectors outside, the continent. And also, as I mentioned, younger generation is a potential that a key for the development as well. For instance, I would say the startups. I think that the younger generation is very much interested in to be, entrepreneurs at this moment. And then when we host like a pitch event, we call it Ninja. Many young generation, raise hands and they bring the ideas. And then that kind of the activity motivate them to be next, entrepreneurs in the continent. And then for us, JICA, we are now collaborating with Auda Nepat for hosting called the homegrown solution to identify the very early stage of the entrepreneurs from the continent over the growth stage. Then I try to, give them the skills for entrepreneurs right now. And then I heard the AFDB planning to build up the new facilities for entrepreneurs at this moment. So we can, connect our activities of AFD together with AFDB, with Auda NEPAD and then AFDB, and then eventually to invite the investors from other countries like Japan and Canada and then other, developed society. So we need such kind of the platform to motivate the younger generation of, the continent. So I just want to mention one sector. It's very difficult to identify the one sector, but it's gonna be a hope of the, sector, hope of the sector for the younger generation to be entrepreneurs in 10 years' time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The same question for ministers. Sir?
Yes, I'm not sure if I can answer the question in full, but Senegal is a low-income country that has discovered oil and gas, and that would become a middle-income country very soon because the production is starting in November. And that we have the ambition of becoming a middle-income country with a middle class. On the continent, you will have a list of middle-income countries with no middle class where the prosperity is not shared. Our ambition as Senegal is to make sure we successfully transition from low-income country to middle-income country. Our President Macky Sall is convinced that to do that, you need to work with the private sector. And as you know, the private sector in our economies is very complex. It's a tiered private sector. You will find at the bottom of the pyramid mostly informal sector, with not registered, not paying taxes. And our role as government is how do we transform that base of the pyramid into successful formal businesses. You will find in the middle of that pyramid our SMEs, the SMEs that drove the growth of China and other countries. So we want to have a critical mass of SMEs, and we have in Senegal what we call our national strategy for private sector development. And of course, at the top of that pyramid, you have your champions. You have your champions that are able to to access larger markets, to venture in the region, on the continent, and what can we do as government to enable that? So all sectors are important because we believe that the energy sector for us in Senegal would be the enabler of gas to power, gas to industry. We'll be able to bring productivity as cost of energy is one of the constraints that the private sector is mentioning. We know that the agriculture sector is critical for food sovereignty. Senegal used to have a variety of indigenous grains. We used to consume sorghum, fonio, millet. And now with the crisis in the Ukraine, it's an opportunity to revisit our gluten-free grains and develop our own sector, agriculture sector, partnering with South, having a South-South cooperation. I will end with that because during the COP in Egypt, Senegal went back with some wheat resistant to drought and to test, because as you know, everybody is struggling to get some wheat. And those inputs that we received from Egypt have been thriving in Senegal. And I think our ambition is to be able to feed ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We continue. Now I turn to Mrs. Aban. The same question.
Great, thank you. And just before I answer this question, I just wanted to say that on the last question and the point that my fellow panelists were mentioning about the link between addressing poverty and ensuring peace, Boy, I wish that my minister was here. My minister was here the past couple of days, and then he just left last evening, but that is exactly what he says all the time. And this would just be music to his ears, because I think we really understand that linkage and how important addressing poverty is in order to achieve peace and security. So on this particular question, again, yeah, I'm going to be similar to my fellow panelists, that I don't know if we can identify one sector, but maybe I'll just shed some light on some of the lenses that we use to think about this, because for us, we challenge ourselves to think of things in a holistic way. So to not look at them per sector, but to really break out of our silos and to try to put things together. I think collectively we're all doing a better job at that, and this is part of our learning process. The other thing is that we look at things and address them at different levels, and I'll just drill down on a couple of them. One of them is the household level and building economic resilience at that household level. So there we think it's really important to focus on financial inclusion, about livelihood diversification, getting access to markets for families, investing in human capital, making sure that people have the skills and the training that they need. Social protection, the importance of social protection for people, and then even at the household level, assistance for the adaptation to weather and climate risks, which impacts everybody at all levels. At the state level, we're very active. This breaks down to raising resources from all sorts of finance. We've talked a lot about private sector and how we want to continue to do better on that. Making sure that resources are spent well. I feel like our most exciting programming is things like gender-based budgeting and ways in which you can do really, really important and impactful things in the way that you plan. Canada is active on the international stage in looking at trying to address the sovereign debt challenges. And so that's an international challenge that we're trying to, with our international partners, to try to address. Really important for us, always alignment with the SDGs. I take the point on data, and I've made this before in previous panels, but it is so critical to have good information, especially we always argue for gender disaggregated data so that we can really empower ourselves. I'll end there, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure Professor Orama will be very happy again to hear that there's alignment to the presentation and the reactions that I'm making. He talked about the need to improve the statistical systems across Africa. So the question of data aligns to that. And the emphasis among the three of you is on the nexus between development and peace. There can be no peace without development, and there can no development without peace. That alignment is very key. And all of you emphasize the need to think outside the box. We need to be holistic. We need to have innovative activities like promoting the startups and also mobilizing the private sector to contribute in the process of sustainable development. That is most welcome news. And the key question of food security, I think that's the starting point. Without the capacity to feed ourselves, then everything becomes very, very, very difficult. And the cross-sectoral approach where everybody is involved and all institutions are involved are very, very, very key. We move to the next question, and I will start with the Minister Sir. What are the barriers, internal and external shocks, that regularly truncate periods of strong growth in African countries? What are the strategies for addressing them in a sustainable manner?
So rather than answering that, I will prepare a call for action. You know, lately the whole conversation about financing is around credit rating. MDBs, large organizations are very much worried about their credit rating. I'm a AAA, I must remain a AAA. And the fact that they focus so much on their credit rating, and the reasoning is that if I have a good rating, I can go to market and I'll be able to mobilize financing very cheap so I can on lend to our member states at a cheap rate. The reality that we see is that the same credit rating is preventing you from having a much larger exposure to my country and to my financing needs, because then they will say you're too exposed to Senegal. You can't give all these resources to Senegal. So the call for action is really for the MDBs to bring back the development into the conversation, at the core of their mandate, to continue to take risks with our economies, because we consider that they are the lenders of last resort. They are the lenders that can help us finance some of that transformational projects that we have in our countries, and we really don't want them to become almost like commercial banks and worry too much about their rating more than taking on projects. The second call for action, or maybe the subject matter I would like to put on the table, is that we understand that climate is extremely, there's a sense of urgency around climate, but there's also a sense of urgency about development. We understand that climate is an issue. We are living with the consequences of climate change. And we need to be able to tell our people that climate issues require transition. We cannot be overnight 50% renewable, even though Senegal can also be the poster child for renewable energy. Senegal has hydro, wind, and solar. Our energy mix is 32% renewable. So we are already, I think, a good citizen in this global public good requirement. But we cannot do that with our meager resources when climate finance is usually captured by the North. So we need to bring back the conversation about climate finance all the way to the country level. And countries that have the will, like Senegal, should be accompanied with significant financing.
Thank you very much. Now we'll turn to Mr. Nakamura.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to say that you mentioned about the barriers, and then we have to say the risks which we faced recently. What happened? We have to review what happened once the pandemic occurred. What happened that once the war in Ukraine occurred. So in order to prepare for that kind of the event, I have to say we set up some, production system, and then I would say within the continent. In order to do so, that AFCFTA, someone mentioned previously, AFCFTA going to be a game changer for the resilience of the continent itself. Because that if it works properly, definitely the competitiveness of the continent will be increased. And then they can, compete with other countries, rest of the world, and then to prepare happen something next round as well. So that the FCFTA going to be one of the hope of the continent toward 2063, I would say. And then, and then also I would say once again that the hope of the continent is the younger generation of the Africa. They are looking for the opportunity. They are looking for the opportunity to be educated and to be trained. And then that the situation has been changed so many. And then I would say the DX, or new technology, imported to Africa quickly. And then they easily, and the younger generation is very much keen to catch up the new technology. and then might be a new innovator to the world. And then they can lead the, not only the Africa, but also the rest of the world. So I would say, please give them the opportunity to join the activities, such kind of innovation and social startup. That is one of the solutions, what I'm thinking about. Thank you.
Mrs. Zaban, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of barriers, but one that I think is absolutely critical is having growth that isn't inclusive is really problematic. And so when we're thinking about economic growth, we want it to be sustainable, certainly. We want it to have long-term viability. We want it to have environmental and social benefits. But we want to absolutely make sure that as we make these investments, we're reaching everyone, and the poorest and the most vulnerable, and women and girls. And I also am in agreement that the time is now. We've just had some big shocks, and we've woken up to the fact that this is the time, especially with a young population. I think this is the time where we can set the right foundation. And so I think there's various avenues, and this won't come as a surprise because sometimes I feel like I'm a little bit of a broken record, but one of the avenues in order to make sure that we foster an inclusive way forward is to invest in women and girls and to make that a focus, as well to focus and to invest in youth. This has tremendous potential. Of course, the green transition, and I'll just end on economic integration and trade, because I think that holds a lot of promise. And if we can unlock that, I think that we can get a lot out of it. And one of the things that Canada has been doing, I had talked about our approach to how we do trade and how that has evolved. But as well, part of our efforts is in helping the countries that we're negotiating with and helping developing countries with their capacity to do trade, helping where we provide support so that there is a good foundation of domestic policies, strong regulations, and the right kind of infrastructure. I'll just end that recently in the past, I think it was just last month, we made a contribution to the WTO, and it was to a trust fund to implement the agreement on fishery subsidies. We're excited about this in kind of our own geeky way. We just felt, we were so excited to be able to make this contribution. And I think for us as a ministry, it's a sign that we're doing a better job about thinking about trade and development better together. And I think there's a lot of strength in doing that. I'll end there.
Thank you very much. The support of Canada to the WTO is very welcome, especially with the focus on the fisheries agreement. I'm working very, very closely with the Director General of the World Trade Organization, and she's leading the process to see if we can mobilize the African member states in the WTO to ratify the WTO fisheries agreement by December this year, because the continent is a fishing continent, and certainly we intend, we can benefit from the process. On this issue, and quite a number of factors also came up. I think one of was the call to action, where we need to improve the system of credit rating. It's very injurious to Africa. It's very, very, very unfair. And the need for the multilateral development institutions to really mainstream the development process in their lending activities. And that basically means that increased concessional and long-term financing. And in fact, the position of Professor Jeffrey Sachs on this issue is that the World Bank and the African Development Bank and similar institutions should be transformed in a manner where each one of them can lend annually about $100 billion under concessional terms and long-term financing. Again, the question of inclusivity comes back. We need to empower the women. We need to empower the youth. So we've taken note of that. And again, regional market development comes into being. If we ignore the process of economic integration through the African Continental Free Trade Area, then we will not make ourselves strong. So all these things need to be factored in our work. So, and of course, the climate should never be forgotten. It's our duty. Although Africa is the least emitter, it's our duty as we go into the next stage of development to ensure that we do it in a sustainable manner. And Mrs. Aban, we go now to the third round of questions, and you'll be the first one to answer this question. Then we'll move on to Minister Sa and Mr. Nakamura. So the third question is, what are the roles and responsibilities of respective stakeholders in the immediate, the short term, the medium term, and the long term to support African countries to achieve inclusive growth and sustainable development?
Well, I think this is a perfect example. I mean, when we talk about roles and responsibilities, we always think about that through different types of partnerships. And so I'll just answer by saying that for Canada, one of the ways that we do that is through our bilateral relationships and through our country-to-country approaches where we are guided by country priorities and where we have a dialogue so that we understand that we're responding to that, and I think it's critically important. And then this is a perfect example where we partner with regional organizations, and I think there's a great strength in that because that allows for an exchange of expertise, it allows for shared approaches, and I think this is absolutely critical. I've used already in my answers to previous questions examples of how Canada is engaging multilaterally and on the global stage, and that includes at the WTO, it includes at the G7, and within all of the IFIs, and I think that that role is really important. When you look at, in a previous answer that I provided, there's different levels in which we engage. There's right down from the individual to the household to the community level and to the state level. Some of those, and maybe I'll just add on a final thought that sometimes for governments like Canada or G7 governments, the state level, these are systemic issues that we really need to tackle. And I think that the outcomes, the development outcomes and the impact take time. And so it's really important for governments to make sure that they commit and invest at the systemic level and at the state level. But I think there's a lot of promise there. And I think multilateral organizations are excellent partners, and the IFIs are excellent partners for us to be able to do that.
Madam Sa?
Thank you so much. For me, the conversation of who do we need to engage with to make sustainable development goals happen has to be at two levels. At the country level, vibrant democracy, where you have to be inclusive in the process of decision making with women, youth, civil society organization, dialogue with private sector, making sure that you have a strong relationship bilaterally, regionally on the continent. The second level of that conversation, President Macky Sall reminds us all the time, is at the global level. You remember during his mandate as the AU president, he kept saying that Africa needs a seat at the G20, where economic decisions are being made, where the financial world is discussing the way forward. We need a seat at the table. President Macky Sall also still says that we need to reform the UN, the same organization that is leading the conversation on sustainable development goals. Is still, at the very center. You have the Security Council with the countries that won the war in 1945 still vetoing decision and deciding on behalf of everybody else. So the reform has a much bigger picture. More people need to be at the table. The economy, the world economy has changed, so more actors need to be at the table. Today, there's a big conversation about the BRICS. What happens with the BRICS? Why 23, 25 countries are trying to join a new bank? Maybe, the existing is not doing business unusual, is not fast track enough, is not fair. So countries will have to find alternatives, because at the end of the day, we like to say, us who are in government, there's a sense of urgency, and development cannot wait.
Mr. Namakamura?
Thank you. From the donors, international organizations' point of view, I would like to say the keyword is stay engaged. That is the keyword for the African development, which we, JICA, learned last 30 years. Because we initiated, Japanese government and we initiated TCAT process. And then that is 30 years anniversary this year. And then situation has been changed dramatically. Where, you know, the TCAT 1 to TCAT 8, which was hosted last year in Tunis. And then we are now reviewing the process of the TCAT together with AUDA NEPAT and toward the next step for the TCAT 9 and so forth. And then I would say the relation with Africa, with, for instance, Japan, gonna be changed dramatically from the official assistance to the Africa to the equal partner with together to be grown for the next 40 years and so forth. And then therefore, we, Japanese government and JICA, would like to learn from your development history last 30 years, and we can share our failure story, even failure story with you. And then I don't want you to take the missteps for the development and so forth. So we can, share the knowledge which you've done in the past. So that the situation has been changed. And in order to create such kind of the relations, as I told you, we have to stay engaged with African continent. And also, we'd like to request the African countries stay engaged with us for the ownership of the development of the Africa from African countries. And then the African countries always to be seated in the driver's seat. And then we are sitting in the maybe back seat already. So, and then as might be, we JICA can probably contribute in terms of the human-centered approach and also ownership and then partnership. Because that the TICAT is not a bilateral platform. We invite not only the AU, but also other donors, like-minded donors as well. So we can share all the information and the knowledge at the platform, and then to give that a good direction or a bad failure story with them for the prosperous development of Africa. That is my ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The key messages there are partnerships. The partnerships at the country level, let's involve all the stakeholders, not just the national capitals, but going deep into the raw areas. Then partnerships at the global level and in diversity. There are various institutions around the world where global partnerships take place. All of them must be fully used there in the process of promoting Africa's development, and that there should be mutual engagement. Africa must approach the partners, and the partners will approach Africa. I think that is going to be possible as we implement the actions to emerge from the study that is underway. The program does not make a provision for inputs from the audience, and I'm going to respect the program, and I know that there are other commitments elsewhere. So my task is at this stage to thank the panelists for giving us great insights on how to move forward in the study. I've been taking notes, and I know colleagues have also been taking notes. We are going to exchange those notes, and like I indicated, others, including the drafters, in the virtual space, they've also listened very, very careful. We are going to make use of the information and the insights that we got from you. So once again, thank you very, very much. And before we leave the stage, I'd like to invite the two vice presidents so that they can join us here to have a group photo so that we remember the very, very good discussion that we had this morning. And with that, we come to the end of the panel discussions. And for the audience, we thank you very much, because without your participation, it would not have been a full discussion. Thank you very much.